I am fairly certain that Yani Neko is trying to tell me something about addiction, avoidance, and the way a person can slowly damage their own life through a series of choices that always feel easier in the moment. The lessons are not exactly hidden. Smoking is destructive, temporary comfort does not solve long-term problems, and wanting to change means very little when you retreat as soon as change becomes uncomfortable. And I understand all of that, but those lessons were not what kept pulling me into the next episode. What held my attention was the curiosity of seeing what Yani would do next, which completely ordinary situation she would transform into another disaster, and whether one of those disasters might finally become serious enough to make her reconsider the way she was living. I was never watching because I adored her, and I was definitely not treating her like some misunderstood role model whose decisions were secretly admirable. There were scenes where my only honest reaction was to stare at the screen and wonder what exactly I had just witnessed, because Yani can move from funny to uncomfortable so quickly that you barely have time to recognize the change. One moment, the series appears to be a simple comedy about a dysfunctional cat girl who smokes too much. A few seconds later, the joke is continued far enough that it begins to look less like harmless chaos and more like a person genuinely losing control of her own life. The premise sounds simple when you describe it from a distance. Yani smokes constantly, lives in terrible conditions, and creates most of the problems that eventually return to punish her. That should be enough for a comedy where every episode resets after another joke about cigarettes, bad hygiene, or her inability to function like a responsible adult. Yani Neko does not always allow that reset to feel comfortable. Some situations become too embarrassing, too unpleasant, or too close to genuine self-destruction, and the series often lets them continue beyond the point where the audience expects the punchline to end. That is where Yani becomes more difficult to categorize. She's not merely lazy in the familiar anime sense, where a character sleeps late, complains about work, and leaves a few empty cans around while somehow maintaining a perfectly functional life. Her entire existence appears to be organized around avoidance. When something is difficult, she delays it. When something is uncomfortable, she escapes from it. When responsibility creates stress, she reaches for the quickest available form of relief. A cigarette becomes a pause button she can press whenever reality demands too much from her. Except, reality does not actually pause, so the work remains unfinished. The room remains a mess. The money continues disappearing, and every problem she avoided eventually returns in a more serious form. Watching someone repeat that behavior should become exhausting, and sometimes it does. There are moments when you understand exactly why the people around Yani become angry, and others when you wonder why anyone is still willing to help her at all. She receives chances that she wastes, support that she takes for granted, and warnings that she ignores until the consequences become impossible to hide. Even when she understands that other people are being affected, she can still choose the one action most likely to make the situation worse. What prevents her from becoming completely impossible to care about is the fact that she is not entirely unaware of her condition. Every now and then, Yani recognizes that something needs to change. She attempts to work part-time jobs, wants to become less dependent on the people around her, and occasionally appears embarrassed by the state of her life. Those moments reveal that she has not completely surrendered to the person she has become. Somewhere beneath the cigarettes, excuses, and terrible habits, there is still a version of Yani that wants things to be different, even if that desire usually disappears the moment it demands anything difficult from her. That contradiction became the most interesting part of the series for me. Yani wants a better life, But she does not want the process required to build one. She wants stability without consistency, independence without responsibility, and freedom from addiction without having to endure the discomfort that comes with resisting it. She can recognize a problem, feel guilty about it, and make what appears to be a sincere promise. But the moment that promise begins to cost her something, the familiar habits start pulling her back. Working requires more than deciding that having a job would be useful. It requires waking up, preparing herself, arriving consistently, tolerating frustration, and repeating the entire process after the initial motivation has disappeared. Cleaning requires effort long after the shame that inspired it has faded. Smoking less requires her to experience a craving without immediately obeying it. Yani wants the result of becoming better, but she has very little tolerance for the part where becoming better feels worse before it starts feeling easier. This creates the cycle that seems to control almost every part of her life. Something happens that forces Yani to acknowledge the consequences of her behavior. She disappoints someone, loses money, ruins an opportunity, or allows her surroundings to become so terrible that even she can no longer pretend not to notice. For a brief moment, she sees herself clearly and decides that she will do better. She will work, clean, become more independent, or finally control her smoking. Tomorrow will be different, and while she is making that promise, she may genuinely believe it. I do not think Yani is always lying when she says she wants to improve, because that would make the situation much simpler. Her intentions often appear sincere, at least while the consequences are directly in front of her. The problem is that a sincere intention is not the same thing as a sustainable change. Once the guilt fades and the effort becomes inconvenient, the familiar options become attractive again. Smoking provides immediate relief. Avoiding the task provides immediate relief. And allowing someone else to repair the damage provides immediate relief. None of these choices improve her future, but they make the next few minutes easier. And Yani repeatedly chooses those easier minutes over a more difficult tomorrow. The relief eventually passes while the consequences remain. Her surroundings are still neglected, the money is still gone, the job still requires effort, and the people around her are still disappointed. Regret returns, another promise forms, and Yani arrives at the beginning of the same cycle once again. She is constantly moving, but almost none of that movement carries her forward. Each completed circle leaves her with fewer options and slightly less patience from the people who continue trying to support her. This was the point where Yani Neko became more interesting than I expected. Addiction is rarely defeated by one dramatic decision. Someone can fully understand that a habit is harming them and still continue doing it. They can feel sincere regret and still relapse because regret is an emotion, while change is a pattern of behavior that has to survive after the emotion disappears. A person can genuinely want to improve while lacking the routine, discipline, environment, or support required to make that improvement last. Yani is exaggerated, but the logic of her behavior is uncomfortable because it is not completely unfamiliar. Her smoking is the most visible part of the problem, although it is no longer separate from the rest of her life. By the time we meet her, it has become connected to almost everything she does. She smokes when she is stressed, bored, ashamed, or trying to avoid thinking about the problem directly in front of her. Even attempting to smoke less creates stress, which immediately gives her another reason to want a cigarette. The addiction strengthens the chaos around her, and the chaos gives the addiction more opportunities to control her. Because her surroundings are disorganized, ordinary tasks become harder. As those tasks become harder, she feels overwhelmed more easily, which pushes her back toward smoking and avoidance. The unfinished task then makes the environment worse, creating even more stress the next time she tries to face it. Yani is not fighting one isolated habit. She is trapped inside a system where every problem protects the others. One good intention cannot repair that system. Yani may decide to work, but employment demands structure, reliability, and the ability to continue when the day becomes unpleasant. She may decide to clean, but the scale of the mess reminds her how much effort is required, making avoidance more attractive. She may decide to reduce her smoking, but nicotine is already connected to the way she regulates stress. Removing the cigarette leaves her with the stress and no reliable method of handling it. Understanding why she fails does not excuse the damage she causes. The people around Yani are affected by her choices, and their patience is constantly tested. Their help is often wasted. Their concern can become another resource she consumes, and their willingness to rescue her may allow her to delay responsibility even longer. Yani wants sympathy without always accepting accountability, and she wants to be recognized as someone who is trying even when the attempt lasts only until the first unpleasant moment. This also creates an uncomfortable question about the people who continue supporting her. There is a difference between helping someone recover and repeatedly protecting them from the consequences of refusing to change. But that difference is not always easy to identify. If every collapse is followed by someone repairing the damage, Yani never experiences the full cost of her decisions. Abandoning her completely would not automatically make her responsible either, because consequences can sometimes force change, while in other cases, they simply remove the last thing preventing someone from falling further. The series does not offer a clean answer, and that uncertainty makes the relationships around Yani more believable. People can care about her while still being angry. They can understand her addiction without pretending that every consequence is beyond her control. They can offer another chance while knowing that she may waste it. Yani is neither completely innocent nor solely responsible for every part of her condition, and the uncomfortable space between those extremes is more interesting than a simple explanation would have been. I cannot pretend that I was thinking about all of this during every episode. Sometimes I was simply waiting to see which new situation Yani would ruin. There is a strange entertainment value in watching someone approach a normal problem with such unreliable instincts. A job opportunity, a social interaction, a financial issue, or a basic household task can become dangerous the moment she becomes involved. You usually expect failure, but you cannot always predict what form that failure will take, which allows even repetitive situations to remain entertaining. Behind that entertainment was the possibility that one disaster might finally interrupt the pattern. Every new problem became another test. Perhaps this consequence would be serious enough, or this person would reach her in a way the others could not. A job might give her structure, and a humiliating experience might remain with her long enough to create discipline instead of another temporary promise. Most of the time, the answer was no, but the possibility remained believable enough to carry me forward. Repetition can easily weaken a story when a character makes the same mistake so often that the audience begins to feel nothing matters. Promises lose their weight, consequences become temporary, and every attempt at progress begins to resemble a reset before the next joke. Yani Neko occasionally approaches that limit, especially when another failure feels less like a realistic setback and more like proof that the story intends to keep her trapped forever. What prevents the repetition from becoming completely empty is Yani's awareness. She is not always proud of herself, and she does not always the consequences away. Sometimes she understands that she has gone too far, recognizes the disappointment around her, or looks genuinely tired of living inside the life she created. Those moments are not enough to transform her, but they keep the possibility of change alive because they prove that she has not become completely numb to what she is doing. I was not waiting for a dramatic redemption or a sudden transformation into a perfectly responsible person. What interested me was the possibility that one moment of awareness might survive longer than usual. Regret is easy when the consequence is directly in front of you, but the real test arrives later, after the emotional intensity fades and the familiar comfort becomes available again. For Yani, progress would begin when she made the responsible choice after she no longer felt inspired to make it. That kind of change would mean waking up on the second day and repeating what she had done on the first. It would require accepting that improvement can feel worse before it feels better, and learning to experience discomfort without treating it as an emergency that must be escaped immediately. There is no final enemy to defeat, and no single speech capable of fixing everything. Yani's greatest challenge is repetition, so her victory would also have to come through repetition. Going to work again would matter more than getting the job. Cleaning the room again would matter more than one emotional attempt to organize it. Refusing the same impulse a second time would matter more than one temporary moment of discipline. For Yani, ordinary consistency would be a greater achievement than any dramatic act of heroism, precisely because it is the ordinary part of life that she seems least capable of sustaining. The logic behind her behavior is not limited to nicotine addiction. Most people have some smaller version of it inside them. They delay a task because avoiding it feels better now, despite knowing that the delay guarantees more stress later. They promise to sleep earlier, spend less money, exercise, answer messages, or stop wasting time, and the intention may be completely sincere. Then the first uncomfortable moment creates an exception. One more day, one more hour, or one more excuse appears harmless because tomorrow is expected to be easier. Tomorrow usually arrives with the same person and the same habits. Yani is an extreme version of that process. Her life shows what happens when temporary exceptions become a permanent structure. Every act of avoidance creates a larger problem, and that larger problem produces a stronger desire to escape. She does not destroy her life through one dramatic decision. It deteriorates through countless smaller choices that each provide a few minutes of comfort, and none of those individual moments seems important enough to explain the condition she eventually reaches. That may be the real warning beneath the comedy. A bad habit does not always become a lifestyle through one obvious turning point. Sometimes there is only another cigarette, another delayed responsibility, and another promise that the future will repair whatever the present keeps damaging. By the time the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, it may already be connected to every part of the person's life. The unpleasant scenes matter because Yani is not always meant to be charming. The series does not completely clean up her behavior for the audience, and sometimes the joke is allowed to remain ugly. She can look less like a lovable disaster and more like someone who has allowed dependency to consume almost every part of her existence. That discomfort prevents the audience from turning her into a cute symbol of irresponsibility and reminds us that the humor has consequences. None of that removed my curiosity. In some ways, it made the curiosity stronger. When a character reaches such an obvious low point, you naturally begin waiting for the reaction. You want to know whether the humiliation, danger, or disappointment will finally become strong enough to create something more permanent than regret. The worse the situation becomes, the more important the next decision appears. That is not the same thing as supporting every choice Yani makes. I was never rooting for her while she continued destroying her own stability. I was waiting for her to stop. There is a difference between loving a character and being unable to look away from them, and Yani held my attention because she constantly appeared to be one decision away from either improving slightly or creating another catastrophe. There is also something honest about a protagonist who does not automatically become easier to like simply because she is the protagonist. Stories often encourage us to forgive behavior because a character is entertaining, attractive, or emotionally damaged. But Yani Neko does not always make forgiveness comfortable. Yani can be funny and still be exhausting. She can be vulnerable and still hurt the people who support her. She can sincerely want to improve and still fail in ways that make you angry. None of those qualities cancels the others. A character does not need to be admirable to be interesting. Sometimes the gap between what someone wants and what they repeatedly choose is more compelling than a straightforward journey toward improvement. Yani appears to want a better life in certain moments, but she also wants to avoid every painful step required to build it. She is not someone who has never imagined changing. She is someone who keeps imagining it without becoming capable of sustaining it. The title may suggest that I ignored the meaning of Yani Neko completely, but that is not really what happened. I understood that the smoking was more than a visual joke, the mess was more than background decoration, and the repeated failures were not simply there to reset the comedy. The cycle of intention and relapse gives those failures their weight, because every time Yani promises to improve, the audience is placed in the same position as the people around her. We have to decide whether we believe her again, support another attempt, or prepare for the same disappointment. The uncomfortable answer is that I usually believed her, at least a little. She had not earned complete trust, but change still has to begin with another attempt, even after many failed ones. A relapse does not necessarily prove that someone never wanted to improve. It proves that wanting was not enough, and that the part of change that matters begins after the intention has already been expressed. The greater danger is that recognition can become another ritual. Yani feels bad, makes a promise, receives sympathy, and returns to the same behavior. After enough repetitions, even regret can become part of the cycle, because it gives her the temporary feeling that she understands the problem without requiring her to live differently. She can feel like the person who wants to change without ever becoming the person who does. That uncertainty made it difficult to decide whether the series was offering hope or simply training me to accept disappointment. Every new intention felt possible because the previous failures had shown exactly what Yani needed to overcome. But each failure also made the next promise harder to trust. The question was never whether she could perform some extraordinary act. It was whether she could become slightly more functional than she had been the day before. I never needed Yani to become perfect, because perfection would have felt dishonest and probably destroyed what made the story interesting. I only wanted evidence that the loop was not permanent. A part-time job she kept for longer than expected. A difficult day that did not end in complete collapse, or a craving she experienced without immediately obeying it, would have been enough to suggest that something was finally changing. Progress might be too quiet to recognize immediately. Stories often present transformation through dramatic milestones, but real improvement can be boring. It can look like cleaning the same room again, going to work again, refusing the same impulse again, and making the responsible choice long after anyone is watching. For Yani, that kind of boring consistency would be revolutionary. Until then, the viewer remains caught in the cycle with her. She creates a problem, appears to understand what she has done, and briefly gives us hope. She tries, reaches the first real obstacle, and falls back into the same habit. Another episode begins, and despite knowing better, you still wonder whether this attempt will be different. Perhaps I am not missing the point after all. The frustration may be the point, and the uncomfortable scenes may exist to prevent us from romanticizing Yani. The repeating cycle shows how exhausting addiction can be, not only for the person trapped inside it, but also for everyone who continues hoping they will escape. Even so, that was not the only reason I watched. I watched because Yani could enter an ordinary situation and make it impossible to predict how badly it would end. Every new disaster carried the possibility of becoming a turning point, and I wanted to see whether someone so committed to immediate relief could ever choose a difficult future instead. I do not adore her, and I do not defend her. She frustrated me, disgusted me, and occasionally made me stare at the screen, wondering how the story had reached that point. But she also made me curious. Somewhere beneath all the smoke, mess, and self-inflicted chaos, there is a person who occasionally understands that she cannot continue like this forever. Understanding something for a moment is easy. Living differently after that moment has passed is much harder, and that is the part of Yani Neko that kept me watching. Maybe I was supposed to see the cycle only as a warning. Maybe I was supposed to feel more disturbed than entertained and recognize that every had something unpleasant underneath it. I understood all of that, but I still wanted to see what Yani would do next.